Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to today's webinar, Quality at Speed, More API Testing, Less UI Testing. My name is Susie. I'm on the events team at Sauce Labs. And before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping notes to go over so you know how to participate in today's event. First, when you joined the webinar, your audio may have connected via your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, you can just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed for you. If you have any questions for our speakers, please submit them via the questions pane in the control panel. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation and we'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A. Finally, I'd like to remind everyone that today's presentation is being recorded and you'll receive an email with links to view the recording and slides following the event. To kick off today's webinar and introduce our panel, I'd now like to turn this over to our moderator for today, Sauce Labs Senior Director of Field Services, Marcus Merrill.
Hello, my name is Marcus. As Susie said, I'm the head of Field Services and Engineering for Sauce Labs, and today it's my pleasure to welcome three experts in testing. Sauce Labs employees who interact with our customers every day and who understand deeply what a transformational difference it can make to have a successful test automation program. At Sauce, we've long believed that testing means more than UI testing. It requires a robust discipline of several different approaches to testing, one of the most important of which is API testing. To that end, we're delighted to have acquired API Fortress, an industry-leading solution for API testing. Let me tell you, the team of experts who have supported the Sauce products for years couldn't be happier. This is a vital addition to our portfolio. That said, our presentation today doesn't talk so much about our own solution as it does the general topic of API testing, its importance, your involvement in it, how you can ensure a successful implementation into your program. So we'll start with a series of short presentations followed by a panel discussion. So let me introduce the team. Jane McNeil, who's our Director of Product Operations, Sanjit Patel, who's a Solutions Engineer, and Titus Fortner, our Senior Developer Advocate. We're going to start by giving Titus the floor to talk about API testing in a more general sense. So take it away, Titus.
Thanks, Marcus. All right. My apologies for not having video. I could not get this figured out. It was working fine before. Let's just jump into why API testing. I love starting off most presentations I give with this next slide here. What does the money want? It's really easy for us to get very focused in and dialed into our specific daily tasks without putting our activities into a broader context. And it's really important to think about what is the company paying me to do? What is my function as a tester, as a developer, as part of the company? And you take it back to this idea of what is the money? The money is the shareholders, it's the CEO, it's the board of directors, it's the people that are looking to get more from what you're doing. And what is it that they want? They want more users. They want the users that are coming to stick around. That means that bugs that they find, that a user finds, get fixed right away. The new feature that the competitor has gets implemented before the competitor. Pretty much all of this requires getting users, keeping them, and making them happy in a way that is faster and better than the competitors. All right, so next slide. So really, I hear a lot of people talk about continuous delivery, and very few people I talk to actually understand what it is or why we're doing it. And the whole point is to try and get features in front of customers, in front of users faster and better. Deliver quality software more quickly. This is the same thing that Agile's been talking about. It's just we're now operating at a larger scope and at better scale. All right, next slide. So what we're looking for at Sauce Labs is to provide digital confidence. We're looking to help people ensure that what they're providing their customers is providing them with what they need, the way that they need it. And really the only way to have digital confidence at this point is with continuous testing. You need to get the releases out there, let the users use them, and be confident that they're getting what you're intending to give them and not something that you're not intending. And part of this is taking a look at every part of the cycle for where you're adding value and having a way to evaluate that you've added the value you intended and didn't remove value in a way that you didn't intend. And so when you're writing code, you're making tests for it. Once you've built it, you've got tests for it. Putting it all, putting this all together. And this is where it comes in, like, what are the tests that we're doing? What is it that we are doing to verify that what we've done is the correct thing, the thing that we're intending? All right, so next slide. First thing to keep in mind, I refer to Selenium Tests as DOM to database tests. We're testing the full stack from what the user is interacting with the browser all the way to the database through API and service layers and back. And this is data that we've collected at Sauce Labs. It's a little noisy, so we can't take this at face value, but realize that this is saying that over 50% of the Sauce Labs users, the usernames at Sauce Labs, show over 50% failure rate. So there's a lot of noise here, but this is still not good. There's still a strong indication that people are really struggling with how to do UI testing. And a lot of it, working with clients and the engagements that I've done, a lot of people are making bad decisions with how they're choosing to do their test automation. They're taking the wrong approach and trying to force it to work, and it is not happening, and they end up with really bad failure rates. And obviously there's some people that have it figured out, have it dialed in, and are doing really well with it. But that's not the majority of the industry right now. And my job and my passion has been trying to help people improve these numbers and try and give them solutions for how to make this better. All right, next slide. So we moved to test automation because manual testing doesn't scale. And like I said, test automation code, writing it well, writing it successfully is very hard. And the first approach that people take is to chase after one of these, I call them magic solutions. These are things like record and playback tools, like Selenium IDE, any kind of codeless test generation tools where you're going through a UI to generate things in the background, anything that says it's machine learning or artificial intelligence. I am on the lookout for one of these that will eventually, potentially, successfully replace what you can do with a test framework and writing good test automation code. So far, I have not seen one. A lot of these are able to handle the easy use cases pretty well. They're not able to handle anything more complicated. There are edge cases that cause problems. There are type 2 errors that get broken, that crop up. And so our goal is to help you be more successful with test automation code, because we know it can work, even if it often doesn't. The magic solutions are appealing, but do not work. All right. Next slide. So there have been two major shifts, revolutions in the quality world. The first one is the shift from a manual testing approach to an automated testing approach. And the second one is, and we'll talk about this more later, is the shift from a mean time to failure to a mean time recovery. And I want to focus on this first one, actually moving from a manual approach to an automated approach. The pitfall that a lot of legacy QA managers fall into is, I have confidence that when my army of manual testers mashes all of these buttons, fills out all of these forms, does all of these things, that the software works and I'm okay to release it. They make the mistake of thinking that the only way they can have confidence for automated testing is if the automation does the exact same thing that the humans were doing. And the idea is, oh, but the computer will do it faster and the computer will do it more reliably and we can do all of these things. the problem is there are a lot of things that humans are able to recognize and deal with and, you know, explore and determine are wrong that a computer never will be able to do. What we want to do in order to have confidence that things are working when using a computer, when doing test automation, means taking a different approach to leverage the things that the computer is actually good at, instead of trying to pretend that the computer is going to be as good as the human at a lot of the things that it's doing. All right, next slide. I love this XKCD comic, as I think it really adequately represents how most people's test automation ends up going. People think, oh yes, we're going to add all of these tests. They're essentially, a lot of people will translate their manual test cases. You know, we got 10,000 of those, so let's write 10,000 tests automated, and they'll do the exact same thing. And the problem is the coding problems, or, you know, minor changes to the website come in, and the amount of time and energy that goes into addressing the maintenance costs vastly outweighs and overwhelms all of the energy that went into the creation costs that we thought was going to be saving us problems, or saving us solving future problems, and it ends up not. On the next slide here, I kind of think of this as like 4 different phases that we go through, that a lot of teams end up going through as part of their automation. You start off like you're building your coverage. You don't have value yet because you're just building the coverage. And then once you hit a certain point, you've got enough coverage, you're getting good results, you're successfully testing, you're finding problems. And then you kind of hit the diminishing returns, where you're adding, each additional test that you add is giving you less value than the previous tests because it's adding to the overall maintenance burden. So you end up spending more time trying to figure out why your tests are failing than determining what the actual errors are because of the failing tests. And, you know, I've had some people say, oh yes, it's just a matter of diminishing returns. And I'm like, it's actually not. Like, once you pass that peak there, you're actually getting negative returns. You have a less valuable test suite at a certain point, with more tests that you've added, with more maintenance burden that you've added, because you end up not being able to find real signals. And this is just when we have a hammer and we think everything is a nail and everything has to go through the browser, this is what you end up with. You end up with trying to force a manual mindset on things, and you end up finding at some point down the road that you can't keep up, and what you're doing is not workable in the long term. And I've come across a lot of teams where I'm like, you're pretty much in a lost cause. Yes, you can spend a lot of time trying to, you know, fix what you've done, but by and large, take everything that's failing that you don't have figured out, and let's start over with something that is more maintainable, that does some more best practice things. All right, the next slide. So when we're talking about how to leverage computers to do things that the computers are good at, we often come to the test pyramid to talk about this. And the classic test pyramid is this, you know, you've got your UI tests at the top, your integration tests in the middle, and the unit tests at the bottom. And the colors here is white for a white box test, which means that the unit test has to know the implementation details of the services testing. UI tests are black box. Essentially, you know nothing about how it's implemented. Like, what is it that's generating the code that you're seeing in the DOM? And everything is about just as an end user interacting with the system from outside the system entirely. And integration tests operate in the gray area where they kind of approach it from a user standpoint, but end up knowing some of the details of how the system is working in order to carry out their function. And so it's a good middle ground. So the next slide. So the problem that I have with the way that most people approach the test pyramid in practice has to do with the traditional roles of the people that are doing the testing. By and large, developers, especially because their developer managers usually are just focused on code coverage metrics. That means they're pretty much just focused on unit tests. Then a lot of the time, the QA tester or the QA team thinks that anything that's not going through the browser directly is an integration test, and that belongs to the developers. So we end up getting a lot of the DOM, the database, full stack tests, and then a bunch of unit tests by the developers. And oftentimes it's not just, a limited number. We've seen like the idea of the test pyramid being that you have way too many UI tests and not enough of the lower tests. And part of what I'm arguing is that there is a better way that QAs can provide value, even without having, a lot of the QA teams don't have access to the developer's code. The developers explicitly don't give QA teams. Either you're siloed or you're just looked down on for various reasons. Whatever it is, you're not allowed to do unit tests. You're not allowed to get into the integration level. You're pretty much relegated to just working with the system completely from the outside. All right, so in the next slide, this is what I'm trying to encourage people to approach this as. This is what I love about API testing. I'm constantly, the reason we want API tests is because even if you're approaching it completely from a black box standpoint, so this is entirely from a QA perspective, you don't have to know how the APIs are implemented. You don't have to know what's going on in the code base. You can act like an end user and still do API tests. And this is a better way to test most of the 10,000 test cases that you've converted to your UI tests. It's much better to do most of those in the API than through with Selenium directly. And that's because every time you open a browser, things get complicated. There's synchronization issues. There's problems with just how different things work. There's overhead to making sure that everything is synchronized and working properly. And there's ways to do it, and I love working with people on how to do that better. But there are so many things that you don't actually need the browser to evaluate. One of the things I see manual testers do a lot is, let's fill out the form in a dozen different ways. Let's try all of these different combinations and permutations of data. Let's treat as a DOM to database test things that don't even get sent to the API or the service layer. So especially in today's environment where most applications have an API, and that is the gateway to the service layer, whether it's coming from a mobile browser or your desktop application or native app, all of those send the same information to specific endpoints in the API. And so from an end user standpoint, you can cut out the DOM entirely and just send that JSON blob in a specific format to the API directly. So if you want to evaluate how is the service layer from the outside handling this chunk of data that I'm sending it. So my general recommendation in the browser, you're testing to make sure that the form works, that the form is properly sending all of the data into the right format so that it's handled by the service layer, dealt with in the database, and then displayed back again in the DOM the way that you would expect. Anything that's handling combinations and permutations of data, anything that's handling things that aren't really something that is affected by the browser itself, all of those things can be done in an API test that's going to be much faster. You don't have to find each element and send keys to each element and synchronize on each element. You just send one chunk of data to the API. It's fast, it's reliable. You're going to get this. It's much easier to ensure that you're getting the exact same response back every single time. And if there's a problem, it's going to show up much more quickly. So this idea that you don't need more access as a QA to be able to get additional value from the way that you're testing, if you can leverage the API to do some of these things for you. And then the same thing for the developers. I can talk about this more, but the idea that they're not spending enough time in the service layer and testing how services work between each other and within the service layer. And obviously this is a dotted line because the developers and the QA should be working together to evaluate these things. And that's what I have for my section. Next up is Jane to talk about some more things here.
Great, Titus, thanks. We're having some internet connectivity issues also here in Canada. So Texas and Canada, hopefully when we get to New Jersey with Sanjeev, I think we'll be in better shape. So we wanted to cover a little bit of like why you should use the API testing, or how does this matter for the different personas. And Titus, I'm really glad that you were talking about this divide and these collaboration points that we can have between QAs and devs. So Susie, if you can go through the next couple here. There's a purpose to it, and it's creating this world of digital confidence. And so if we build out this slide, I will say from my time working with the field services team and in other test automation organizations, this is a constant conversation that we're having with our customers is how do we make sure that we're collaborating across the board within all of DevOps? So there's a lot of tool variety that people can use, and it can be very difficult to actually interpret that signal that's coming across. And from a Sauce Labs perspective, I think, Susie, if we can go to the next side of things. Yeah, it can look a little bit like spaghetti. We want people to be adopting a solution, something that's a little bit comprehensive. And this is something that will help people reduce those points of friction between different teams that are working and involved throughout the process. So that's Sauce's perspective on why we wanted to bring API testing into the fold and why we develop our products thinking about how we can be agnostic to the different types of personas that we have to support, the different types of tooling and technology that people are working within. And we want to make sure that this is this consistent and seamless messaging across the board. So we are super excited about buying API Fortress because we think this is going to lend a little bit of a branch back out to a different set of personas. And I think, Titus, we're going to talk about that a little bit more before we throw to Sanjeev. If we can go to the next one, Susie. What's happening? This is content that I actually took over from Marcus. So Marcus had worked on this talk, and we've delivered this to lots of different customers and at a number of different conferences. But we talked about the journey with DevOps. So if we could build out the rest of that piece, all of the different components around gathering requirements, around development work, and around testing and getting things ready for release, and then all the way up to monitoring analytics, which is more around the operating model. If we wanted to lay this flat on its side, it's speaking towards these concepts of shifting left and shifting right. So, sorry, the next one. I'm trying to go through this because I want to make sure that Sanjeev has enough time to get into the API Fortress piece. All right. So if we look at this as an actual progression, it's pretty easy for us to chart out where we're doing shifting left, where we're advocating that devs get a lot more involved with testing. So it's happening earlier in the process. The thought process around this is that if you catch things earlier, it's less expensive. There's less conflict if you're catching things earlier. When you get devs involved in the process, then there tends to be less finger pointing and blame. But the concept around shifting right is making sure that you've got something ready to go in production, and so you're constantly managing and monitoring and seeing what's progressive about this. And so there's, I think, one more animation that goes along with this, Susie. The idea is to create a little bit of this like boring world where it's just super consistent across the board. You're getting messaging coming in from both, and you're thinking about how that signal is going to be strung together and used by all of the teams. So when we see our customers, particularly our digital leaders, get this right, you're seeing very collaborative organizations where they know where their roles are. Everybody is taking quality quite seriously, and then those inputs are feeding into each other. And so, Susie, if we can go back to the next one. This is why I was particularly excited about the content that Titus was talking about initially. We hear about the testing pyramid constantly. I mean, I feel like we don't have conversations when people are asking us to provide guidance on their strategies where they're not talking about, the number of tests that you have in this different space. And maybe it's because it's existed for so long. I mean, it's been around for about 15 years. When Titus developed this content around the testing diamond, I was particularly excited because I think it's a little bit more of an accurate view. So Titus, you kind of started talking about this initially. Maybe you could take us home with how you think this testing diamond allows our QAs and devs an opportunity to collaborate in the center.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. So part of this is also, and the service layer test includes API testing as well. And typically the API testing that you can do in a gray box setting is going to be a little different from what you get in a black box setting. There's more things that you can do, testing the API between different services, like whatever the contract is between services is super useful. And then essentially what the API is providing to the service is something that can be tested. So the idea here, and the reason I'm moving this to a diamond instead of a pyramid, is that I find unit tests can often be overrated. And that's kind of a controversial statement, and I'm still working out some of my thoughts on this. But I have seen a lot of unit tests. I've written unit tests where the only way the unit test can fail is if I change the implementation. So running it as part of a regression suite isn't telling me anything more than the fact that I have changed the code. And maybe it's useful to have that to make sure that the next unit test that you're writing represents what you intended to do with the new code that you wrote. But by and large, continuing to run unit tests, I've seen people end up spending days rewriting unit tests just because they changed their code. And those unit tests aren't providing value as soon as the code has completed being written. The other thing that I've seen that's a problem with unit tests is they often have to make assumptions about the state of the real world. And so a lot of times I've seen implementation, like real world implementation has changed, and the unit tests have not updated their assumptions about what they're testing. So assuming I get this response back as a string, then I expect the service to do this. And sure enough, that's what happens. But for some reason, I'm a Ruby developer, the string got sent back as a symbol because we changed it because that's the right way to do it, but it comes back as a symbol and it's broken. But because we're only testing the string, because we're assuming it's a string in the unit test, things were broken in Selenium. This was for Selenium tests themselves. Ruby Selenium was broken for setting, native extensions in Internet Explorer, something like that. It was broken because we were making an assumption. I think a lot of unit tests end up in that pattern. And so oftentimes you also see service tests that are duplicating things that you're getting in the unit test. And I just see a lot of value in evaluating things at the middle layers a lot more. So less time in DOM to database tests, less time in the unit tests, spending more time with service tests, and that includes API testing, both shifting left and shifting right here. Like a lot of this is shifting left, but then it's also an ability to take a look at the same functionality from a real world perspective when moving to the right. So that's the final take on this here.
I really do like this perspective, Titus, and I think that it just further cements the decisions that we made around bringing API Fortress into the fold for Sauce Labs, and that's why we're super excited about it. And I think with that, it's probably a good time to throw to Sanjeet, so he could tell us a little bit more about how to get it done. Oh, Sanjeet, I think you're still on mute. But I can.
Yes, I was.
It seems like you got a good flow. Let's go.
Great. Yeah, I agree 100% with Jane and Titus in that, API tests are very important and should be looked at in the same sense of unit tests and D2D testing. So let's jump right in. So I think at a high level, the biggest question is, how do you API test, right? What are the things to do when you're API testing? So the best practices are kind of broken down into two. The basics, which we can move to the next slide, are really things that most of you are probably already doing, right? These are things that are the most basic of API tests, right? You test the endpoint. Are you able to hit the endpoint and it returns a response and a good status code like 200, right? You should be, most people are, but a lot of people aren't, but you should be testing everything, not just that the API returns with a response code, but things like the content type headers or any other headers that are returned, as well as the body. And that brings us to the last point, testing the objects, right? So not only testing that the API works, but that it responds as it should respond correctly. Yep, and then we can move on. And then these are some of the things that if you don't have an existing API testing framework, you're not really doing, right? So writing tests that you can reuse by variabilizing them so that you can run one API test in multiple environments, your staging environment, your development environment, production, and then writing tests that confirm your business logic. So not only does the API work, but is the API returning things like it should? Like if you're giving it an ID for a product, is it returning the information of that product? Using dynamic data. So this is not just pinging an API to test one case, but giving it a string of dynamic data to test all of the possible scenarios that that API can respond with. Integration or end-to-end testing. This is, I think, super important, and we'll kind of look at this a little bit more in the coming slides, but this is where you're testing a flow that you would normally do in a UI test, but doing it with APIs. And then the last one really is just exactly what I said before, which is confirming that what you're passing in is you're returning the right information. We can go to the next slide. So I think the biggest question is what makes a good API test, right? So there are two aspects to this. And if we jump to the next slide, the first aspect is functional testing. So this is where you are testing essentially everything, right? You're hitting the API, and is it returning what it should? You gave it a parameter of red. Is it returning all of the items that can be that are available in red? So like in this case, the products all have a red option. And so validating that because you are calling the API with a parameter of red, that it's returning items that are available in red and not ones that are not available in red. And then the second piece is what we talked about earlier, which is integration or end-to-end testing. Right, this is testing a flow. You asked for products that are available in red. Now you see one of the products, you grab its ID, which is ID 3, and then you query the API again for that product ID and validate that the information that it returns is correct. And this kind of leads me to my last slide. And I'm sorry if I'm kind of moving through this a little fast because I do want to show a little bit of the platform and what I mean by this. But this is exactly what I'm talking about, right? Typical UI testing, you would test a flow like search for a product, find the product, add it to the cart, and then check out with all your checkout information. And that's a typical UI test that's done all the time. But typically when you're doing this, all of this is backed by APIs, right? When you're clicking add to cart, you're really telling an API to put that item into the cart. When you're checking out, you're telling the API that you're checking out. And so this exact flow is something you should be testing in your API test, right? Call the API that searches for products, then find the product and call the API to pull up the product information. Then call the API to add that product into your cart, and then check out and then finish up the process. And so if I can present. Perfect. So this is kind of what I'm talking about in the sense of a integration or end-to-end test, right? You call your first API, you validate some of the responses of it, and then you go into the products and you grab that ID element and you call the next API to validate that that ID element for that product is returning what it should be. And again, you can see that I'm validating kind of all of the response objects as well as the status code and some of the headers. And then you can add in business logic like this ID should return something that is clothing or furniture. Things like if the shipping is available, then the zones object should be included in the response. It should not be included if the shipping is not available. So testing real life business scenarios, integrating kind of multiple APIs together to test an entire flow. And then I think a big thing that both Jane and Titus brought up was not only shifting left, but the shifting right side, right? So this is testing in production, being able to catch errors in production faster and recover faster. And so a big thing with API testing is, especially with functional and integration testing, is the ability to run these on a schedule. So when you schedule tests, you can have them run on a recurring framework. So I have this one run every 10 minutes, and this just gives me an idea if my functional integration test that I've written is working correctly, and as soon as it fails, I can get alerted and immediately look into my production environment to see why this API test is failing. And really, it gives you this ability to look and see all of your data from all of the tests that have been running. It gives you this, what we call production monitoring. And it really just gives you this opportunity to not only shift left by writing tests earlier and writing API tests before you even get to UI testing, but also to catch errors in production much faster, recover much faster, have that historical data to see the trend of your APIs and your tests that are being scheduled and executed again. That's it for me.
All right, cool. Well, we're going to start our panel discussion now. I'm going to use a combination of questions that were submitted between the submitted to the portal before we began, and some of the ones that we see here on that the viewers have submitted onto the webinar itself. Sorry, I'm a little bit scattered here. Okay, too many panels open. So I have a question first for Sanjeet. I'd like to, Jane's turning her camera on. I guess I should turn my camera on. All right, how about do that? Wanted to throw a question to Titus Fortner to start with. Titus, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
This should be a somewhat simple question, but this will get us started off, hopefully. How important in API testing is it to test data types for values? Like, how important is it to do the sort of boundary checking that we do? You know, we all learned in our first QA jobs, send an integer, a string to an integer type. How important is that kind of thing for endpoint testing for an API?
Well, I guess I'll put it this way, is that when you have 100 of those tests or hundreds of those tests in your UI suite, you're going to be causing yourself a lot of pain. And so it's important to test those things. It's important to know those things. I would argue that those aren't as important as some other functionality that you could be testing. So if I was writing a UI test suite, that wouldn't be the first thing that I would add, but I do think there's value there. But you shouldn't need to be testing that through the DOM in order to get that value. And so there's value there. It's like the perfect thing to do with an API test is the application that I'm sending this to, is the web app, is the service properly dealing with the data that I'm sending from an external perspective? Because you could have a unit test that's testing something back and forth, but maybe that's not what the user is actually sending to the system. So you get the external response of yes, from the API to the database and back, it's doing the right thing, but it's not needing to go through the browser that adds the extra complexity to that. And so it's really the combination that provides that additional value.
Cool, sounds good. I wanted to throw a question pretty much to everyone. I'll ask everyone this question, which is, in general, what are the biggest challenges that you've come across when it comes to API testing? Start with Sanjeet.
Yeah, I think a couple of the biggest kind of things you run into with API testing is you might have some of your developer, because again, this is that middle layer of testing, right? You have some of your developers writing API tests. You have some of your QA teams writing API tests. They're not collaborating. They're not working together on it. And so that kind of breadth of coverage isn't really there. So when you can kind of work together to get that middle layer, I think it makes a huge difference.
Great. Titus?
I would just echo what Sanjeet has said, actually. No, I just wanted to chime in and say that it's been for sauce, is we haven't had a solution in this space to kind of point to. And so that's one of the things that we wanted to advocate for people, is to start to reduce those points of friction. And that's why we're glad that we've got API Fortress in the fold now.
Yeah. Titus, biggest challenges with API testing? I know you've done your fair share in, hospitality and e-commerce in the real world.
Yeah, real world challenges. I think trying to figure out, like, the way that a lot of my colleagues were testing APIs was essentially just hard-coded in JavaScript Postman commands and things like that. And so it was testing very specific things in very specific ways. And just from a bigger perspective, as someone who is a Selenium core contributor and writes a lot of open source and tries to solve the general solution for things, that was a very frustrating approach for me. I'm like, well, we need some way of scaling this. We need some way to test more than just, does this specific thing work in this specific instance? And so I think the challenge I had was trying to build up something like that. And I think we ended up for that project pretty successful, especially because I was able to leverage the Selenium code that we had for the data that we were generating for the Selenium test. We were able to leverage that and use that as part of the API test. And so essentially the same data objects were getting sent to a page object or an API wrapper object. And so we were able to send things back and forth between those. And it was a really great way to enhance the DOM to database tests, because we could compare the things that were going to an API with what was in the UI. It's really, I mean, this is a kind of another thing of really leveraging APIs is being able to use it for setting state and validating results in the UI test itself. So I'm just a big proponent of leveraging APIs as much as possible for everything you can.
So in a general question, follow up to that, Titus, I'll start with you, Titus. What kind of a macro or overall data management strategy have you been able to employ? And then, so we'll talk about that in general, because I know that's one of the biggest challenges, as Igor points out in our Q&A panel. And then I want to move to Sanjit to talk about how API Fortress in particular handles data management. Okay.
Yeah. So in general, and I talk about this in a number of my presentations and things like that, the different ways that you can manage test data. And really what it comes down to, the only way to scale your testing is to run tests in parallel. And the only ways to have successful parallel test execution is for your data to be completely autonomous. And that means every single test, I call it just-in-time testing. Every single test should be responsible for all of the data that it uses to the fullest extent possible. You want to edit an object, create a brand new user with the settings that you want, create a brand new object with the settings you want, then edit it and evaluate that the edit works. Like you want to be able to be explicit about what has been set and what the state is so that you get repeated results. And so, being able to abstract out data objects as part of your testing and keep them entirely independent from each other is really a crucial part of being able to scale your testing successfully.
Sanjit, how do you make this into a concrete practice with a tool like API Fortress?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's a big recommendation that we always have, right, is to contain all of your data within the test. And typically, when we talk about data driving your API tests, the best way to do it is to use your APIs to data drive your other APIs, right? Because generally, the APIs are going to feed into each other. And so you don't want to be loading and testing data, like Titus said, because it makes it dependent on something else. You want to be able to use your real life data that one API returns to drive into the next API to create it. Once you create the user, you use that information to edit the user, and then you use that same information to delete the user, all through the API. With that being said, we do understand that a lot of people are used to having testing data in CSVs and databases. And so API Fortress does allow you to connect into file structures as well as databases to pull in any of that data to data drive your tests as well.
And if I could follow up on what Sanjit's saying there really quickly, I mean, this is one of those ideas of testing your assumptions. What he's talking about right there is exactly what you need, because if you're using the API to set the user, then you know that the user is there correctly, as opposed to like there's a lot of solutions, FactoryBot in Rails that'll take the model information and auto-populate the database with data from what the model says. That's not how the end user puts data in the database. You're testing, and maybe that's a fine trade-off. But you should know it's a trade-off and know that you're making it. You're not testing the data the way that the system is actually storing the data.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So another sort of panel-wide question. I'll start with Jane this time. I'd say someone asked, how do you approach automation challenges where you find that your users are using things differently from the test cases that you designed when you were sort of, workshopping how you're writing your test plans, and then you find, oh my gosh, people are doing things quite differently from the UAT kind of testing that we were doing. So start with Jane, and then we'll go around to other real world experiences.
Yeah, I actually really loved Titus's points earlier on this. Is about like the right level of automation, making sure that you're automating the right things. We do see a lot of people go into this, mind frame of saying automate absolutely everything, and they're lifting like manual tests into automation. And I think that's okay for a little period of time while people are starting to learn how to automate. But we always caution people that we want you to make sure that you're putting in points of inflection to evaluate your test suites and make sure that there's things that are serving you well, because we also deal with customers that have a lot of broken testing, right? And so if you're not on top of that from a maintenance perspective and thinking about, are these tests valuable? Are we automating the right things? Then you're going to end up in a path where you're getting a lot of clutter, a lot of, clouding that signal. So you have to be sharp, and you have to think about how you maintain and manage things. And it should be the right level of automation. Is it repetitive, versus automating absolutely every single different type of case, right?
Yeah. Sanjit, have you run into this before, where the users are ending up doing things quite differently from the way you predict that they will?
Yeah, definitely. I think a big thing, and not to get too kind of into the API Fortress side of things, but when we talk about automation of API tests, we typically consider automation of kind of that generic, what we talked about was testing objects, testing endpoints, all of that stuff. That's low-level testing that kind of should be automated, right? So API Fortress gives you the ability to automatically generate tests that handle all of that for you. Those are the sorts of things that are not necessarily time wasters, but can be automated away, right? Then when we talk about integration testing or testing your business logic, those are the sort of edge cases that only a user could know. And so that's what we always recommend, is like, you don't try to automate away your integration testing, your business logic, because only you know what the business logic should be, and you should build that out yourself.
Yeah. I think it's going to be interesting to get to this next question. We've tried to stay really high level and stay kind of above the product specific question, but we're getting so many questions rolling in specifically about API Fortress. I do want to ask you one question, because this, I was in QA for 20 years before I came to Sauce Labs, and one thing I repeatedly ran into was the question of, can I auto-generate tests based on a contract? And Sanjit, I want to throw that to you. Do you have the ability in API Fortress to auto-generate contract-based tests?
Yeah, that's essentially how when I talk about those low-level tests that test everything, that's what I'm talking about, contract testing. And there are two ways to auto-generate that in API Fortress. One being, you make an API call, and then the platform looks at the API response and it builds the contract itself. The other way being, if you have specification files like your Swagger, OpenAPI 3, those sorts of things that define the contract of your API, those can be imported in as well, and the platform will auto-generate all of the assertions to validate those things.
Yeah. Someone else is asking if it's primarily UI based or primarily, something that you would write code to manage. How do you see users using API Fortress? Is it primarily through the API, or code based? How are people using it?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. I think the primary use case is very much UI based, as it is kind of targeted towards getting the QA teams into the API testing layer. However, every test that has a nice little pretty UI, has an underlying code view. You can write the test in code in an IDE outside of the platform, and then use the platform to execute those tests. But I think the biggest primary use case is the UI. Once you do get to learn it, it's much easier to do that than write it in code.
Yeah. So Titus, over to you. I'm curious, do you have an idea? So, I mean, we have the pyramid, and the pyramid, or the diamond, has this sort of, essentially it's kind of based on numbers or maybe even time in terms of the broadness of the field we're looking at. Do you have an ideal ratio between UI and API tests, or is that something that's just thoroughly product dependent?
it might end up being more unit tests than service layer tests anyway, but I don't like the knee-jerk, everything should be a unit test and then everything else gets built on top of that. And so no, I don't have a ratio. I think a lot of it's going to be very context dependent to your site and things like that. And that's another thing. A lot of the luminaries out there that write their blog posts don't take into account just how much variation there is in different applications and different use cases. But yeah, just the idea is just to spend more time thinking about what's being done at the middle layers there with APIs, with contracts, with services, both from a black box standpoint and a gray box standpoint. There's just huge value in what you're getting from that because it represents more real world than you can get just from unit tests, and it's much more reliable and easier to scale time-wise than running a lot of DOM to database tests.
Right. So we had a question earlier that I answered, used a whole lot of words to answer in the text, and y'all probably didn't see it because y'all are busy actually giving this thing. So for a second here, I get to sort of be on the panel and talk about something. Somebody was asking in the chat whether or not, basically, if we're hammering the UI constantly, are we really doing too much testing? Trying to think of what the actual wording of the question was. Was it said that QA should do more API testing and less DOM to database? And so my answer to that is, and I want your validation on this because I think I'm right. Essentially, you got 400 tests and you're iterating through all these steps, step by step of trying to make sure that your business logic is sound. My opinion, and I would be glad to hear the input from all three of you. My opinion is that there's a really good chance that if you've hit the same pages 400 times in the same workflow 400 times to test the business logic, you have already proven that the UI layer is fine, right? You hit an endpoint, you have proven that the UI is capable of rendering the output of an endpoint or a series of endpoints properly, and that your job is done. So now at that point, it's time to consider cutting the browser and the CSS and the JavaScript and the HTML and the PHP, whatever it is, out of the process and just start hammering the UI, the API endpoints to make sure, because that's where your business logic actually lives. That was my answer. I believe it is correct. I'd like to hear yours. I'd like to add one more piece to this question and then take it around to all of you before we wrap up. This will be our final question. The question is, can you also end up having too many API tests like you did back in the UI days if you make this transition? And what do you do to avoid this kind of problem? Let's start with Jane, if Jane has a good idea.
I actually don't have an answer. I'm looking more towards Sanjeet to answer that question. I'm curious because I think we've always advised to have something that's like pretty streamlined, right?
Yeah, it's my answer too. Is I'm not really sure because I've never had that problem. So what do you think, Sanjeet?
Yeah, for one, I agree entirely with you in that at some point you've done enough UI testing to where it's not really giving you any more results or any more incremental results. In terms of API testing, honestly, I haven't seen too much API testing. You can really create lots of API tests to cover all of your scenarios. I think the biggest thing we run into when we think too many API tests is when you start creating tests that are very individually focused. So in the API space, we talked about integration and end-to-end testing. I think those are much more important. So instead of having 5 tests that test each individual aspect of it, like loading data into your cart, checking out from the cart, instead of having 3 separate tests that validate that, those should all really be one test, one flow test. And that's where you kind of run into there's too many API tests. But I think once you do have that flow test, having all of the scenarios covered, you can't really have too many to cover all of your business logic scenarios.
Cool. Titus, anything to add there?
Man, I have so many thoughts. So shocking, right?
Another hour.
Titus has opinions. So again, one of my frustrations with the traditional test pyramid has to do with testers not feeling empowered to move things to a lower level. They only think in terms of the DOM, and that's all they're doing. And I'm really encouraged, and this is where it comes down to the digital confidence idea. Here's a feature. how confident are you that that feature works if you just do an API test? I would argue that most of the time you're doing something in the browser, you can actually do it in an API test and get all of the information you need to be confident about that functionality. And for someone who's a Selenium expert, I advocate like a minimal UI test suite. And this is where it comes down to, how many is too much? And this really comes down to maintenance costs. If you're running more tests than you can keep up with the failures, then you've lost. And so you need to be able to keep up with how many failures you're getting. And it's a lot easier to get those failures in a UI test that you have to deal with than an API test. And so part of it's going to be context dependent. How often are things changing? Should your APIs change? You keep adding things to your API that's going to cause a problem. Are you adequately addressing things like that? And this is where the hard coding things gets frustrating for me, is you're just testing one specific thing and not recognizing that, hey, additional things were added, and maybe if you add something or something like that, the service layer is going to screw it up at this point, instead of again, keeping it to what the user is actually sending it. And then, but the great thing about an API test versus the unit test, and this is kind of where I talk about type 1 and type 2 errors, is with a unit test, you end up testing assumptions. With any of the black box tests, there are no assumptions. You're sending what the user is sending. You're sending what is real, and you're seeing if the system processes it. And so write as many API tests as you can that you can keep up with. And it's just a lot easier to keep up with those than with complete DOM to database tests. So that's my answer.
Well, we have a lot of questions that are going to unfortunately go unanswered in this webinar, but we will gather these questions and answer them hopefully in a FAQ or something like that for all participants. And Susie might have more to say about that when we're wrapping up. In the meantime, I want to thank everyone who's here: Jane, Sanjeet, Titus, and Susie, and our organizers with GoToWebinar. It's been great. It's been enlightening, and I want to encourage everyone to go to apifortress.com. Keep in mind, we made the acquisition about 1 month ago and haven't fully integrated all the branding assets and everything like that. So at the moment, they look like two separate products, but we be integrating them over time. So please go to that apifortress.com. There's resources, data sheets, white papers, webinars, links to videos, explanations, demos, everything you need. And I hope you can all go there because it's an amazing product. Thank you, everyone. I'll hand it over to Susie now.
Great. Thank you, Marcus. And thank you so much to Titus and Jane and Sanjeet for all that great content. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today's webinar. As Marcus mentioned, we have lots of wonderful questions here that are currently unanswered. We plan to share more on the Sauce Labs blog in the near future, so please stay tuned for that. And as well, Marcus mentioned that you can learn more about API Fortress at apifortress.com. And finally, just 2 quick notes before we close out today. First, when you exit the webinar, you'll see a survey on today's presentation. We would really appreciate it if you can provide your feedback, share your thoughts. We'll continue to share webinars and improve our content going forward. You'll also receive a follow-up email on Monday that will include links to view the recording of today's webinar, as well as the slides that you saw at the beginning of the presentations. With that, on behalf of Sauce Labs, I would like to thank you all for joining us. Thank you again to our wonderful speakers, and enjoy the rest of your day.